just waiting for somebody to get wired.
Oh.
And then we will begin. Well, let me begin. Good morning. I'm Matthew Goldstein, the Chancellor of the City University of New York, and I'm just delighted to have all of you here this morning at the inaugural event of the Drum Major Institute. Before I begin my remarks, I would just like to acknowledge a few people. If we did not have these individuals involved, this event would never have been conceived, nor would it have been implemented. I guess it started with an attorney, Harry Wachtel, who was a confidant of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He was his attorney. He was his soulmate on many of the social issues that were transforming society. And it was Harry Wachtel who came up with the idea of the Drum Major Foundation. And his legacy is now carried by his son, William Wachtel, who is seated here in the front row. And Bill approached me at around the time that I was appointed Chancellor of the university and said that we ought to do something important. And what we have today is the start of something important. So Bill, I thank you for your vision and your energy, and all of us are deeply grateful to you. We're delighted to have with us Martin Luther King's son. Did he arrive in the back? Oh, I thought he was with us this morning. We have Andrew Young, Ambassador Andrew Young, who you will hear from later this morning, and Mrs. Young. We're wonderful to have you. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Young. You do look much younger than that. It's wonderful to have you with us. And so many others who are going to make this a very, very important day. We thank you all. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Drum Major Institute, including Andrew Young, who I've just mentioned, who is the chairman, Bill Wachtel, our founder, John Marino, a director, John McConnell, a director, and Bernard Nussbaum, a director, we thank you for the energy that you put towards this event. And Leslie Dimitri, who worked tirelessly on all of the components of this event. She's standing in the back. Leslie, thank you very much. And for our local assistants here, Brenda Verchese, and others who were very helpful, Chris Catino, we thank you for your work. 36 years ago, when I graduated from CCNY, our commencement address was delivered by Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was only 34, but he had already gained considerable attention through his nonviolent desegregation efforts in the South. It was 1963, and Dr. King was pushing hard for a national civil rights bill. But he was running headlong into two arguments: that only time could eliminate the problem of racial injustice in America, and that it was impossible to legislate a change in morality. He was clearly vexed. Human progress, he told us, is not inevitable. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of dedicated individuals. Without this hard work, he warned, time is on the side of forces of social stagnation. And I quote, "We must see that time is always right to do right," he said. Martin Luther King Jr., as we tragically know now, had no time to waste. So he kept talking until enough people listened. In the following 2 years, Congress passed both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, opening the American dream to millions of non-white Americans. But Dr. King didn't stop there. He redirected the conversation to living conditions of blacks in northern cities, and then to the waste of the Vietnam War. He was a drum major for timeless principles, peace, justice, and righteousness, and many of us were swept up by his drumbeat. 35 years later, we have no fewer problems. Some persist from this day, including racial discrimination, and some are entirely born of the computer age and globalization. But vital conversations of the type that Dr. King spurred are largely absent from today's landscape. They have been replaced by sound bites, short-term solutions, and government by pollsters. We're here today in an effort to spark some new conversations about problems begging for serious long-term solutions, inequities among our schools, and violence in our classrooms. This is the first forum in a planned series by the Drum Major Institute. The goal is to mobilize new ideas and solutions to problems facing our country in a nonpartisan environment, one that brings together elected officials, academics, business leaders, and everyday citizens. As someone who has spent most of his career in academic life, I feel privileged to be part of this conversation. In recent years, the Academy has distanced itself from the, quote, real world and tended to instead live in our own little gardens. It's a great way to avoid the frustrations of engagement, but it's an abdication of what I believe is a key role of our universities, one of moral and intellectual leadership and constructive criticism. It was recently pointed out that one of the definitions of academic life listed in the American Heritage Dictionary is, quote, scholarly to the point of being unaware of the outside world, end quote. The trouble is, the outside world has a habit of creeping into our hallowed halls, like it or not. There is no better example of this than our first topic of discussion today, inequities in educational opportunity. The City University of New York every year admits large numbers of students with high abilities, but we also encounter too many students who lack the basic skills they need to survive in a higher education environment. Most of our students are graduates of the New York City school system. It is a system that deals with a student population far needier than most regions of the state, and it produces uneven results, some stellar and some marginal. It spends less per pupil than the statewide average, and its results averaged for all students fall below statewide expectations. This is not just a New York phenomenon. We can plug into the data warehouses for school systems in any state with a large, poor urban area, and we would find similar disparities in funding and achievement. And in too many areas, the disparities are growing, a reflection of the widening gap between the haves and have-nots in society. Education has long been the great leveler in American society. Regardless of where you start out, if you pay attention in school, study hard, and aim high, you have an opportunity to rise to the top. That is the promise of America, and education has been the tool to fulfill that promise for millions of Americans. I count myself among them. But if the tool is blunted, or if it's missing its handle, it makes it more difficult to fulfill that promise. And where there is no promise, hope sometimes gives way to despair and alienation. We must ask ourselves whether educational opportunity can be equal for a student in the Bronx who is trying to learn physics from a teacher who is not certified to teach physics, or possibly not certified to teach anything. In an age ever more dependent on information technology, can educational opportunity be equal in a Boston school that has half as many computers and internet connections per student as its counterpart in suburban Brookline? Can the promise of education be fulfilled in a Philadelphia school that has half as many books in its libraries, most of them well out of date, as the school a few miles away in Chestnut Hill? Or in a South Chicago school where 20% more students are packed into each classroom as one in Winnetka? There are those who contend that money is not the issue, and they point to schools producing consistently high results in the poorest communities. I will be one of the first to say that money is not the whole issue by any means. I believe strong leadership that has the support of government leaders is vital. Setting high standards and pushing students and professionals to reach them is critical. So is creating a system of accountability for pinpointing and correcting problems early on. But money does count, particularly when your students start from behind and have fewer educational supports at home and in their communities. Here's what money can buy: certified teachers who receive in-service training and know the subjects they're teaching, smaller classes that allow students to receive greater individual attention, up-to-date textbooks and well-stocked school libraries, up-to-date talent and creative school leadership, technology geared to enhance learning, not rote drilling, clean and well-maintained school buildings that convey to students that they matter and that education is valued in our society. Intellectually, most people will agree these things are things that all students should have. But in many communities, there is a resistance to putting more resources into our schools and college due to a belief that we are not spending the dollars that we have wisely. Managing resources more effectively and being held accountable for decisions about how money is spent will be as critical to resolving the educational equity issue in the future as more dollars. One way or another, we must unite more people at a minimal level of educational opportunity. Until we do, we as a society will continue to grow apart, living in ever more separate worlds, fearing those on the other side of the divide. Unless this issue is addressed in a real way, I see it leading to a disuniting of these United States. So let's talk today about how to ensure that every American child receives a quality education. Our second forum topic is closely related: how to ensure every child a safe school in which to learn. A 1999 joint report issued by the U.S. Justice and Education Departments tells us that despite media coverage over recent multi-victim shootings, such as those occurred at Columbine High School in Colorado, our schools are safer today than they were 5 years ago. The number of violent incidents reported has indeed gone down. Yet that report and others paint a shocking picture to anyone who left school decades ago. Across the nation, 46 homicides, 11 suicides, and 1 student killed by a police officer in the 1997-98 school year. More than 130,000 violent crimes against teachers. 1 out of every 12th grade nationally reported being injured intentionally while at school. Every day, more than 100,000 elementary and secondary students across the country bring weapons to school. Each day in the school year, 40 students are wounded or killed by those weapons. 1/5 of the students in our nation's schools are afraid to use school lavatories, fearing that they will be victimized. More than 1 in 4 students report street gang presence in their schools. Our children are living in fear while they are trying to learn. And in our urban school districts, they live in the greatest fear. The National Assessment of Educational Progress reports that the percentage of Black and Hispanic 4th graders who report feeling very unsafe at school is 4 times higher than for white 4th graders. How can this not affect their learning? We can hope to contain the problem by installing metal detectors in schools, beefing up security, implementing zero-tolerance policies, and teaching conflict resolution skills. We know how to do those things. But it seems to me we must also address the violence and alienation we have reaped in our society as a whole if we are going to make much progress. Much of what our children are learning, they are learning from us. In closing, let me return to Dr. King's admonitions to my graduating class, and I quote, "No nation or individual can live alone in the modern world. We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. All life is interrelated, and all men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." So let us open these discussions this morning and commit ourselves to creating thoughtful, viable solutions. We will start with a panel of educational inequities moderated by New York Times editorial writer Brent Staples. Brent is a good friend, a fabric of this great city, somebody who grew up poor and knows many of the issues that I have addressed, but he overcame enormous obstacles, finalizing with a PhD from the University of Chicago. And I was very privileged that one of the men that he worked with was a very dear friend of mine who unfortunately is no longer with us. So Brent, it's a privilege to have you moderating this panel. We look forward to a real engagement during the day. And again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Let me just assure you as I speak that this is the last brief block of talking you will hear. Henceforth, after I give a few opening remarks, people will be responding to specific scenarios and specific questions. There'll be no speeches from the panel. First of all, let me just say that a court suit brought by something called the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. A group of parents and community activists looked around at the funding formula and saw that over the years, New York City students were being shortchanged in the funding formula from the state. And they brought a suit, and through persistence and sort of hard work, that suit is in trial today. And let me just talk to you a little bit about some of the things that you might not be hearing coming in that trial. Because the state, of course, who's the party who's being sued, now is in the peculiar position of arguing that sort of a subpar education is sufficient. The premise of the suit is that the largely minority school body of New York City is being so poorly educated because of fewer textbooks, because of fewer certified teachers, because of crowded conditions, being so poorly educated that education does not meet the constitutional requirements of the state to provide a minimal basic education. So the state and the consulting law firm it's brought in to defend this suit is in the peculiar position of arguing that, in fact, the education it offers is sufficient. Now, this has brought us to some real quandaries in recent days because the basic premise of our educational movement in New York is increased standards. As you all know now, pretty soon everyone's going to have to pass Regents exams to get a high school diploma in New York City. And there are areas of the state where as few as 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% of the students have access to the necessary Regents courses. There's areas of the state, areas of the school, as my colleague Ms. Weingarten, head of the Teachers Union, can attest, There are areas of the city where maybe 1 in 4, 1 in 3 teachers are uncertified. And we do know now there's a direct relationship between the percentage of certified teachers and student attainment and reading levels. We do know that. And so we were brought to a situation last week in court, and I haven't, so don't print this, but I have the transcript on my desk at work. We were brought to a situation last week in court where an executive was on the stand testifying about the quality of students who come out of the public school system. And he was saying, minimally, we want these students to be able to be a telephone operator. Okay? He was saying minimally, at the minimum, you know, and that's getting to be a harder job. And the state, from what I understand, was in the position of arguing that may be too high a standard to meet the constitutional level. And if you're from the law firm here, you'll get a chance to talk. But understand that it's cut and dried. It's been in our paper, the New York Times. And it's therefore true. It is true that the state is in court today, essentially arguing that the inferior education that maybe half the students, maybe more, in New York City is getting, meets the constitutional criteria. Now, I'm telling you, I'm from 3 generations of preachers, so forgive me. I'm telling you that that's immoral. I joke, but I'm telling you that's immoral. It may be legally acceptable as a strategy, but that's immoral. Because if you're black and Latino in New York City today, black and Latino in America today, the education you are getting in most places, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, where I grew up, South Side Chicago, the education you're getting in the Bronx amounts to cultural genocide. So let me just say that. And so there's no question about where I stand. And I'm a moderator, so I'm going to be moderate. First of all, let me just say briefly that we did not arrive at this place by accident. We did not arrive at this place by accident. Since the founding of the Republic, and later on with the establishment of compulsory public education, there's been a debate in America. As I said in an essay earlier last year, American education was hobbled from the start by the twin presumptions that mediocrity is acceptable and that excellence is available only to the privileged few. If you look back at, let me refer you to Richard Hofstadter's book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. Richard Hofstadter, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1964. And he's one of the few books I know who really, really gets this right. In the mid-1890s, a national task force called the Committee of 10 called for a strong academic curriculum for all high school students, whether or not they were planned to attend college. The 10 decried what they called the feeble and scrappy courses offered in American schools and advocated a rigorous regime that included 4 years each. Listen to this now, 1894. 4 years each of foreign language, English, literature, 3 to 4 years of science and math, and 2 to 4 years of history. The committee said that a strong academic curriculum was essentially important for students, especially important, for students not bound for college, to prepare them to participate knowledgeably in democracy. That's an astounding thing. Let me just read that again. 4 years of foreign language, English and literature, 3 to 4 years of science and math, and 2 to 4 years of history. You understand, if this sounds familiar to you, you understand that what happened a few years after that, another committee was convened by bureaucrats and others and classists who decided that, in fact, that was just too high a standard for most people to meet. And they decided at that point that that kind of education would be wasted on women in particular, who weren't going anywhere but cooking anyway. And they specifically decided that it would be wasted on the great unwashed who were coming in from abroad. Because we in this country had established from the beginning that the best quality education was going to go to the privileged few. Now, so you see, the lawsuit I mentioned to you at the outset, the inequities that are being discussed all over the country, in New Jersey, in court, in New York now, all over the country, in Serrano, in California, this inequality is in the fabric of the nation. It is one of the basic assumptions upon which the Republic is built, that some of us are more equal than others. That's what it is. So, and if I could say, among you, to those of you who are educated, if I could just preach to you just a little bit. You know, if you're in this room, if you're in New York City, there are certain presumptions about your politics, and if you're an educator, there are certain presumptions about how you feel about students. You know, how you feel about human potential. But what we are hobbled by in this country is the basic idea that human potential is somehow inborn, and people can never rise above what they are given at birth. That was the few years ago, that book, The Bell Curve, was extraordinarily popular, and that tells you the appetite we have in this country for that kind of belief. We're stuck here in America between these twin presumptions of inborn potential means everything and hard work can make you who you are. You see what I'm saying? Those are the two warring presumptions at the bottom of who we are as a culture. So if you are a teacher here, if you are an educator here, I challenge you before we begin here to, when you walk into your classroom and look out into your classroom, and if you teach in New York, you're teaching a largely minority population, you look into the faces of those children before you decide who you think is smart, who you think is dumb, who you think is lazy. Examine where those presumptions come from, how you're making those decisions, and how they may be profoundly affected by race. It's unconscious, preconscious, but if you're in the school, and that's my last little sort of shot on that one, because it's not just them out there somewhere who are treating these children badly, who are underestimating their ability. It's the people who's standing in front of them. So we have a scenario here, and with all respect to the chancellor who introduced me, of whom I'm greatly fond, the problem, I think, in the education debate today, and I'm going to try to bring this out with my panelists, the problem, I think, is that we get often hung up in the question of the few versus the many. How can we ensure all versus the few? And let me say a little bit more about that. What I'm saying is violence itself is a terrible problem. And I can tell you personally, and just say a few things about myself. Personally, I'm the second oldest of 9 children. I was the only one in my family to go to college. I'm from 3 generations of truck drivers. And I had a brother who was a drug dealer who was murdered, who dropped out of school. All of my siblings, except for me, dropped out of school. So I know from whence I speak here. But when we talk about how we can preserve access for all children, or how we can help all children, how we can help all schools, how we can make sure all schools are peaceful and clean, we sort of beg the issue of how we negotiate in the day-to-day up to that time. I'm talking about the individual here. And I want to begin with a basic scenario, and I'm going to ask my panelists to respond to it. The basic function of school is to teach Janie and Jimmy to read. What we know from NIH and a great many other studies, which I've written extensively about in the editorial page, is that if children do not become free and independent readers by 4th or 5th grade, they have a devastatingly low chance of becoming anyone in life. So the first 4 years, we've got to get that working. We've got to get that working. We don't have time to mess around. And this is a question I put to Al Gore, and I'm going to put this morning to Ms. Ravitch. I said to the vice president the other day, I said, because we were talking about about school reform, vouchers versus restructuring schools and so on, and we got into a rather heated debate. And I said to him, Vice President, and I said to him, you have a daughter. Welcome, Mr. Schmidt. Benno Schmidt, ladies and gentlemen. I said to him, Vice President, you have a daughter. His daughter named Corinna, by the way, you probably all know. And she comes home from school, the first year of school, and she can't read at grade level. Okay? She's in a school in a sort of a bad corner of the city, and she comes home in the second year and she cannot read. Okay? And you know that by the 4th grade that that a cloud is lingering over her. I said to him. So, Vice President, I know you are not in favor of vouchers. I know you're not in favor of privatizing education, but what do you do for that child in your home when, in fact, she has no act, and you can't quite afford to go to private school. You can't afford to go to Sidwell Friends. And you know you have 4 years to act. So, Ms. Ravitch, what do we do with that child? And that child in second grade, and we know we have to fourth grade to get her turned around.
Okay, Brent, I guess the question would be, what would I do as a parent, or what would I do as an educator being asked to advise that parent?
Answer which way you'd like.
Well, as a parent, I tell you what I did with my own children, which they do with their children, or one of my sons has kids, the other doesn't, which is to read to them every night, to go over the sounds of letters. But we're not in a society or a system where we expect parents to take the responsibility for educating their kids. That's why we're paying taxes to have a public school system. So I would say that the first thing that would concern me is, do the teachers know how to teach reading? And are they using the research-based methods, which you know since you referred to the NIH reports and also the reports from the National Research Council. We now know that children need phonics as well as literature. And I've been in school after school in New York City where nobody knows how to teach phonics. I've gone to the ed schools and asked, is there anyone here who trains teachers to teach phonics? And they say, we don't do that. We teach whole language, we don't teach phonics. And I said, are you aware that the research says that kids need this? They are not aware of this research. So I think there's a fundamental problem that teachers are not being trained to teach the most effective methods. And if I were trying to strengthen and preserve the system, I would call together the deans of all the ed schools and say, you are not preparing teachers to be effective reading instructors. And I would not have people teaching the reading classes who didn't have a demonstrated record that their kids actually learned to read. So there's a kind of a system-wide answer, what do you do about the system? But there's also, what do you do about the individual parent? And that it all depends on how old the child is. If I were a parent, I would be working with that child to make sure that she learns to read before she's in third grade. And I happen to believe that every child, other than the very small number who have very serious cognitive functioning issues, every child can be taught to read successfully.
Okay. Let me just jump in a little second here and say, for those of you who don't know the research, what we basically know is that children do in fact need phonics, what you described. And that basically 1 in 4 children roughly, will not learn without it. So if you got a kid in school who's having problems reading, you better go see what they're teaching. 1 in 4 children will not learn to read at all without it. It's over. Game over.
But Brent, can I just add that there are a lot of kids today who are labeled learning disabled, NIH says that about 40% of the kids who are labeled learning disabled never were taught to read. They're not learning disabled.
Mr. Mattiello, you answered the system-wide question. Let me ask you, as a parent, what in heaven's name do you want done with your child at that point? I mean, what would you do? Your child, what would you do?
It's a great way to start this conversation off this morning, because I think that's one of the fundamental problems all of us face in the educational system is the, young children's ability to read. My daughter Ariel has been on a computer since she's 3. She's 6 now. I'm 52. I don't know how to start a computer, and I'm embarrassed to say that. But the fact of the matter is we read to her every single evening. She will not go to sleep unless we read to her or her sister Madeline, because they're accustomed to that from their father or their mother. So I think, Ms. Ravitch is right. In the school setting, there has to be more of an emphasis on reading and more insistence that students don't get moved on unless they're fundamentally sound in reading, because if you can't read, you can't do math. If you can't read, you can't talk. If you can't read, you can't think. If you can't read, you can't dream. So there has to be that emphasis, or greater emphasis, in the classroom. However, it's not all just classroom related. I think there has to be a greater emphasis on educating and teaching and working with parents on how to be parents, how to be more effective parents, how they need to instruct their children and work with their children with those kinds of reading tools at home, because you just can't learn to read, and you can't just do it in the classroom during classroom hours. I think there has to be, in our system today, especially in urban centers, a way to get to parents to help teach them how to be better parents and how to help educate their children more.
Reverend Flake, I still haven't heard a satisfactory answer, because I am, in the name of full disclosure, let me say to everyone, At the New York Times, we have strict disclosure policy. I mean, everything's got to be above board. In the name of full disclosure, let me say to you all that I've been a bachelor for many years, and I'm about to be married. And with my marriage has come a son who is just on the cusp of 17. And as many children do, he had a few problems in school, especially when his parents broke up initially, and that sort of goes on. And I've placed him in private school because I couldn't, in a high school, I could not find in my zone a school that could give him the kind of attention to catch him up that he needed. So I placed him in a private school where he is, in fact, in a class with 10 people, 10 students. And when I went to parents' night the other night, his biology teacher took out a computer, pushed a button, up on the screen came every class he'd attended, what he'd done in that class, every assignment that was outstanding, where he needed to go, and he just printed it out and said to us and said to the kids, so there could be no question about it, you know. And that's basically what I paid for. So in full disclosure, let me tell you, I had this decision to make, not for a young child, but a child of my own household, and I chose the private option. Reverend Flake, let's go back to that little girl in 2nd grade who's coming home, who's trapped in that worst possible scenario school where no one knows phonics, no one is really caring what the chancellor is saying, and she's coming home to you, Reverend Flake, 2nd year. What do you do with that child?
I think you have to look at it two ways. First of all, obviously I've been able to afford for my children to go to my own school and then to Catholic schools. The reality, though, is I think we have to, we make some presumptions that every parent has the ability themselves to read and to teach their children. Our reality in the culture in which we're living now is that parents who have young children, many of them are products of the same system that is not educating their children. Therefore, they have not been educated, therefore do not have the skills and abilities to educate their children. So that a great onus then is placed upon trying to create educational environments where expectations are so high that every child believes that the teacher is interested in their learning to a degree that they actually demand of them that they meet that level of expectation. One of the great challenges becomes, all too often, as you said in your opening statement, there is an assumption that certain children cannot learn. My history has been that most children can learn if the expectations are high. So that when the school mandates homework, challenges parents to know that that child must have it and that that parent will be called that night or the morning that that child shows up without that homework,
Amen.
then it makes all the difference in the world. The response of the parents becomes one of, I have put my child in a place where the teachers are demanding, therefore I have to demand more of myself. The level of involvement that comes, this is Sunday, this is Monday, after preaching 3 times on a Sunday, it's hard to do this, first thing Monday morning, so I'm losing my book. But the level of expectation that is placed on a child often determines the level of expectation that a parent will respond to. And I know that I find in our school that even parents who are not educated themselves find means by which they can get the necessary support system, grandparents or somebody in the family who gives that assistance, as well as our teachers demand that their child has homework every day, the expectations are of such level. Now, in the absence of that, in the absence of an ability to find that in the public system, I think you have to create as many alternatives as possible. So that, for me, the vouchers, the charter schools represent a possibility for that parent who cannot get that child the kind of education that is necessary, cannot get them access to the necessary tools at a 2-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, doesn't matter the age. We have to create some alternatives because the system will not reform itself quick enough for a generation of children who need that particular access now. And if we don't create that access right now, we're going to lose that child.
Let me just say, I want to reinforce, Reverend Flake has come back to the point I made earlier. The conjunction or disjunction between the broad solution for all, okay, and the one solution and the solution for a few, and the solution for the one. You see, there is a religious scholar, Jewish religious scholar in New York, good friend of mine, who is fond of telling me that in his faith, that if you save one child, it's as though you would save the world. Save one life. It is the same as saving the world. Ms. Weingarten, we have Janie in 2nd grade. She's in a school that's not getting better. We know that Janie is doomed by 5th grade if she's not a self-sufficient reader. We know that the parents, maybe let's call the parents blue collar. Let's call them out of work. Let's call them they can't really afford books. Let's call them, let's say there's no one in their family who graduated from college like mine. I mean, I know people in my family who knew slaves in my family. So let's call it that. Ms. Weingarten, Janie, the deadline is ticking, the clock is ticking on Janie. Why can't we just give Janie some tuition and send her to another school? Why can't we give her public money and send her to the Windward School? Or why can't we give her public money and send her to Miss Brearley's school? What can we do? What are you saying to us?
4 things. I can answer the why, but I'd rather do that afterwards. The first thing I'd like to answer is the obligation of the public schools to educate Janie. And this whole issue about individual versus system is an issue that I have been grappling with myself, because you can't wait till the system self-adjusts in order to help every single individual child, even though you want to help. You need to do both of those things. So in the short run, what does the school system have to do? It has to do some of the things that it is trying to do right now, even though it does not have the resources to do it. So it has to be on track for standards, but in the way in which Diane defines it, where people both have high expectations and the skill base and ability to do the job that they are required to do. The variable has to be time, because as the NIH and other research shows, kids learn in different rates. And as we all know, every single parent is not going to read to them like the mayor of Buffalo may read to his children. And so we have to acknowledge that, accept that, and try to compensate for that. We have to, as a result, end social promotion in certain areas, in certain grades, immediately. And those tests, as much pressure as they put on teachers, and they do, as you have seen in the last few days, the tests are a very interesting check and balance, because the 4th grade ELA test does show and say to people who has learned to read at this point and who hasn't. And so ultimately, the system, now that it has the tests, and even though it doesn't have the resources that it needs to help every single child get there, the system has an obligation through the ending of social promotion and through interventional supports to give every single child those interventional supports right now. Now, why would I, once I say and focus on individual children, why would I be so totally against vouchers? For 4 reasons as well, or for 3 or 4 reasons. Number 1, when you look at the ELA scores on a systemic basis, you look at the English language arts scores from the 4th grade test this past year. Very interesting result. The schools in District 12, the parochial schools in District 12, where the public schools did poorly, the parochial schools did just as poorly. Where the public schools did well in the suburbs, the parochial schools did just as well. So if the test results show that, then ultimately that's not going to be a solution. Number 2, the schools ultimately make the choices, not the kids and not the parents. And then we're still going to have a group of parents who need the public schools as a place where they have to be able to demand that kids receive a decent education. Number 3, in Milwaukee, where there's been this experiment for years, the public schools didn't get any better. The whole issue about competition spurring on the public schools, they didn't get any better. And number 4, even though you're going to hear a lot, people, bicker, I should say, with this data all the time. It is unclear whether when you track kids who've gone to voucher schools or taken a voucher and gone to schools versus kids who haven't, whether there really is a palpable difference in achievement. Most of the research says if you lower class size, you can get better achievement results. Now, given that that is the research, I feel like we are in a race. I feel it very profoundly. And ultimately, as Brent said earlier, if we're already spending, and I think as the Chancellor said before, managing resources is a very important issue, but if we're already spending $3,000, $4,000 less than our suburban counterparts, I'm not talking about private schools, I'm talking about or private charter schools, I'm talking about our suburban counterparts, then how are we going to get enough certified teachers, particularly right now when the Board of Education thinks it needs 54,000 new teachers in the next 5 years, and we already right now have 10,000 uncertified teachers. How are we going to get enough certified teachers? How are we going to lower the class size? How are we going to have well enough maintained buildings if we don't try to figure out how to get every single penny into, not the bureaucracy, but into those schools? I don't know the answer to that. The teachers are willing to do the high standards work, to do this without having the resources to back it up. The union is trying to do various different things to accommodate that. We're trying to put a core curriculum together from our own dues money. We worked with the Chancellor to create this grand experiment this year to turn around 40 schools at the same time, focusing, on language arts and on math first, and lowering class size first. But ultimately, at the same time as we have to do all of this patchwork right now, if we don't create a system that gives that promise, we will never, in the long run, give that promise to all kids.
Let me just say a word about teachers. Those of you who are teachers in the room, I was recently, not so long ago, departed from your ranks to become a reporter. I taught briefly, 3 years, secondary and university level. I want to say, first of all, that as an editorial writer for the New York Times for 10 years, I have always tried to convey in my columns and editorials a respect for teaching and a respect for teachers. And I had to, as one of 9 children, I have a lot of nieces and nephews who from time to time will call me for advice, career advice, what to do. And I had to advise my first niece who graduated from college 3 years ago, who has a love of teaching, not to come to New York. I had to advise her of that because, first of all, I told her what the salary was, the starting salary was for her. I mean, don't quote me on this one, but I think the starting salary for a reporter in New York City now is probably like $62,000. And what's the starting salary for a teacher now?
On December 16th, it's going up to the grand number of $31,900.
Okay, so I had to tell my niece, I know you really want to teach in the big leagues, but you need to go somewhere where they'll pay you a living wage. So I understand and I respect teachers. I respect what they do, because when I was on my book tour in 1995, Miss Riley, my English teacher in 12th grade, came out of the retirement home to come and see me read. And I get choked up talking about it because she made me read Shakespeare, which saved my life. Okay? I respect teachers. But Mr. Smith, in this scenario of all this systemic change, and we need phonics, and the teachers' wave are coming and going. We need 54,000 replacement teachers. The schools are falling apart, and we're suing the state for our fair share of money, and we're suing the state to say, state, you need to understand that our children are as good as those children in Westchester County. They're as good as those children in New Canaan, Connecticut. They're as good as those children in Saddle River, and we want them to have a chance. All that, I'm doing all that. I'm jumping up and down in the pulpit I have. But Mr. Smith, Is there a moral reason? Is there a moral explanation? Is there a moral grounding to keep Janie in that failing school when we know that school is going nowhere and we know that Janie's going to get in the 5th grade unable to read? Is there a moral rationale for doing that?
No. I think the most important imperative in public education ought to be that parents, children in failing schools have some sort of options to change their situation. Now, I don't myself think that private schools are a practical option because there are a lot of Janies out there. There are 45 million kids in public education in the United States, and private schools couldn't accept, if they wanted to, and they don't, couldn't accept all the youngsters who are in failing public schools. So I think as a practical matter, we have to focus not only on the kind of choices that Reverend Flake discussed, but we really have to focus on improving public schools and creating within public education the kind of choices and options that can give children and parents, and I think teachers desperately need the same freedom to get out of schools that aren't working. So what I would try to do is within the public system create opportunities for all kinds of actors, the unions, universities, churches, to create new public schools to give youngsters and parents who are caught in failing schools the chance to move out. And that's why I support choices within public education and think myself that is likely to be a more fruitful public policy and personal policy for Janie than just focusing on choices outside the system, because we really don't have the resources currently outside the system to help youngsters like Janie. Now, there's a lot of things I do in the schools too. I mean, you referred to the research, and there actually is a lot of research about how to minimize the number of kids who reach the 3rd or the 4th grade without reading. And it's to me, it's a striking and glaring problem in many schools that they're simply not organized, as if the number one goal of the school is to create a base of literacy. I mean, we don't even test kindergarten and 1st grade children for the most part because we don't know how to do it. They can't take multiple choice tests, and which are cheap to administer. So we don't even bother to test them until they get to the 4th grade. It's too late then. You have to organize schools to focus on literacy in kindergarten and 1st grade and 2nd grade. And everything in the school should be subordinated to that goal. Everything. Everybody ought to teach reading. There ought to be 2.5 hours a day. There ought to be tutoring. All the resources of the school ought to be focused on literacy, and that just doesn't happen in enough schools.
Ms. Ravitch, we started with you, and you know I'm trying to hold on for dear life to Janie, because although these things are all good, and you know, I know the research too, and I teach reading too, and I know the value of it. But have you heard a satisfactory answer for Janie? We're going back again between the 45 million and the 1. Okay. Ms. Ravitch, is there a moral explanation? I'll put it to you as I put to Mr. Smith. Is there a moral rationale? Is there a moral rationale for keeping Janie in PS number sign, because I'm not going to say a number because everybody's here. Is there a moral reason for keeping her there? And let me just stipulate, let me just say, for example, as now a new parent who's had to make some choices, I had to find out that when I wanted to apply for a variance for my kid to go out of my area to another area that might have a suitable thing, that some of the schools might have a variance for as many as 10 children. A few may take 10 children out of district. May take 20 children out of district. Okay? So is there a moral explanation?
Yes, and you ask a very important question. And you go back to why we have a public education system. It's not to control people. It's not to create a bureaucracy that has the right to control everybody and tell them that they can only go to school A, but they can't go to school B. And not to give the power to a bureaucracy that can run a district line right through the center of an apartment building and say that kids who live on this side of the building go to this zone and these kids go to another. The public education system exists to serve the public, which is why I no longer believe in things like zoning lines and district lines, and I think it's wrong that computers should decide where kids should go to school. I do think that parents should, if your child, if it's your Janie, and that school is not teaching her to read, and you've been to see the teacher, and you know that spending 2 hours a day on doing the wrong thing isn't going to work any more than spending the 30 minutes or an hour a day, you, as I believe, have a moral right as a parent to take Janie out of that school and try to find some place where she's going to be taught to read, because otherwise you are going to have a child who, as you say, will be so hopelessly behind that she'll never catch up, and with dire consequences. I think that what we've lost sight of when we talk about the system is we talk about this as though it's some kind of a government agency that has power over the lives of children, and if we put our trust in this system, surely it will do the right thing. But we know that's not true. And the system, when the system was designed, it was designed along factory lines. And my colleague Steve Bromberg here, who's also a historian, knows this. It was created in the period from 1896 to 1902, when people thought, well, we'll make the schools look like factories. Most of the kids leave by the age of 12 or 13. We'll do our best to create exactly the same school everywhere. But what we know now, 100 years later, is that system no longer functions. It doesn't work. 50% of the kids who start 9th grade do not finish 12th grade, do not get a high school diploma. If we had a hospital system that worked that way, where 50% of the people who came in with non-fatal ailments died, we would be screaming. I mean, I do think we have a moral crisis confronting us with the very uneven quality of public education. I know Kenneth Clark, for example, was writing back in the 1950s and 1960s about the fact that schools in Harlem and in other poor neighborhoods were getting teachers who were the greenest, least experienced. The turnover, the dropout rate of teachers was tremendous. It's exactly the same situation today. We have not changed that at all. And I would say, the great business philosopher Peter Drucker said, if you look at a system today, you have to ask yourself, if you're going to reinvent it, would it look like this? And I suggest to you, if we were to reinvent this system created 100 years ago, we would not create what we have now, which is a system where teachers are paid substantially less than those across the city line, where principals are paid $30,000 to $40,000 or $50,000 less than principals across the city line, and where they can immediately, get a 30%, 40% increase just by moving a few miles. And where we have had over the past 5 years a massive brain drain of both teachers and principals. And this explains why we have 10,000 uncertified teachers, I believe. So we have, I think, a somewhat disastrous system that centralizes everything except learning. And we don't want learning centralized, but what we want at the central headquarters is clear standards for what kids are expected to learn, assessments not based on norms, which is a disaster, but assessments based on standards. Can Janie read in 2nd grade? Can she, or is she where she should be at that point? We don't have that kind of a system. We have an irrational system, which is, it's like producing automobiles where 50% of them don't work, and yet we continue to tinker with the assembly line, and the assembly line itself is wrong.
Mayor Masiello, I got a question for you. Let me just drop one more enlightening fact. One of the schools I specialize in, one of the states I specialize in over the last several years has been California. Because California itself, as you know, a few years back, California used to have the public education system that was the jewel of the nation. From cradle to grave, you could go to school. You could go to school in public school and end up at Stanford. And then they came a few years back, and the National Assessment for Educational Progress, the reading scores, California dropped to the bottom, was tied with Louisiana. In the last few years, they've been trying to do interventions out there and they've had trouble because the state university system, for example, they've gone to the state university system and said, well, you know, Dean, President X, you're teaching people to teach reading in the way that's killing our public education system. We're going to go to Washington and bring back NIH work. We're going to bring back workbooks. And we want you to teach. Every teacher comes out of here knows how to teach reading. And you know, this is the state system. It's paid for by tax dollars. And don't you know those deans of those education schools are saying to them, well, you know, we have academic freedom here. You know, we can. This is scholarship. This is, you know, we can go on the way we want to. You know, we can do whole language. We can do reading recovery because we have academic freedom. And my answer to the legislatures, and I wrote this in the column, very simple. You hold the purse strings, and we've done it in New York, and we'll see how it comes to pass. However, in New York, you know, they're going to be closing schools of education very shortly, where too many people failed certification exams, and that's going to be a real eye opener. It's going to be an ethnic conflict. It's going to be a government conflict. You know, because in fact, I can tell you quite frankly, given where the schools are located, the first colleges of education to be closed will probably be in minority communities. But in any case, so we have this inferior teacher supply, right? And that's not every teacher. I said to Ms. Weingarten, I love Ms. Weingarten. I think she's great. And I said to her, as I said, I respect teachers. But we see these charts that show uncertified teachers. The students fail in schools with uncertified teachers. So we got to get some more. Mayor Masiello, you got a big pulpit. Buffalo, big city in this town. I know you've had problems over the years. I know that last book by Verlin Klinkenborg, The Last Fine Time, about Buffalo, about the decline of the industrial base in Buffalo. I know you got trouble in River City. But can you go to your people and say, we need to levy a tax because our public school students are in jeopardy. We need to levy a tax, right? And what we need to do, in the poorest neighborhoods, we need to build subsidized housing for teachers to live in. We're going to have teaching villages, right? We're going to have teachers with high salaries, and we're going to require them to come from the best schools. We're going to draw them off from Colgate, okay? We're going to draw them off from, you know, what's that fancy women's school in Poughkeepsie? We're going to draw them off, and we're going to say we're going to hold them to a high standard, and we're going to have a place where people in the poor neighborhood can come with their kids who are having problems, and they'll be able to use that system just like Brent Staples uses his kid's private school system, where he can call the teachers 24 hours a day. Okay? Can you sell that to your people?
How long do I have to answer this question?
You're the politician. You can, you know.
Well, I can answer that question for the rest of the time.
Of course.
By the way, let me preface my response to that by telling everybody, you mentioned California. I also have a daughter who teaches, who taught last year in Orange County. I won't tell you the school district, 31 students, 5th grade. Most of them couldn't read by the time they came to 5th grade. So it's not here just in New York City. It's not in New York State. It's all over the country, and that's a real tragedy. Very difficult question to ask, and I'll tell you why. You look at our own tax base in the city of Buffalo. 80% of the students in Buffalo get free or reduced lunch. That's an indication of the poverty. 45% of the kids come from depressed neighborhoods. Our tax base has been shrinking, as everybody knows, just like other upstate New York cities. So the question is, can we raise taxes? Very difficult thing to do, because when you raise taxes, you drive people oftentimes who can pay the taxes to other communities that perceptually they think they can get a better education. So, you know, what we're doing in Buffalo are several things. Number one, we are in a very short term going to announce the building of 5 to 6 new state-of-the-art schools. Some in inner-city neighborhoods, some in not inner-city neighborhoods, but accessible to people from throughout the city of Buffalo. That will give them access to quality buildings, but in those buildings you will have technology, and you'll have books, and you'll have libraries, and you'll have a lot of state-of-the-art things. Is that enough, though? I'm not sure that's enough. I think education, to me, is on several parallel tracks. I think paying teachers is an issue, but it's not the only issue. I think technology and books and all those other things and learning ambiance are important issues. Schools need to be a focal point of education. All those things are important. But how you're going to pay for them, number one, is a significant issue. And number two, how do you impact on the other parallel track? And as I said in my earlier remarks, from my experiences of visiting schools, my experiences in dealing with poverty, my experiences in talking to teachers. Unfortunately, a lot of people in my profession and in the legislature never talk to educators. They don't know what the obstacles that these kids are facing. They don't know why Janie can't read. Firstly, we got to find out why Janie can't read. Does she have a learning impediment? Does she have a mental health problem? Is it her family situation? It's not always the teacher, him or herself. So the fact of the matter is, can we raise taxes? Very difficult to do, Brent, in all honesty. However, I think if you do things on the merit, if you could show the taxpayers that there will be quantifiable results from that kind of investment, you can do it, but it's difficult to do. And I got to tell you, in Buffalo, New York, we're very fortunate because we do get a very, very strong support from the state as far as funding education per capita. We do very well. I'm not going to complain. Usually everybody complains they don't get enough. We do very well. The problem is, conversely, our tax base is so poor and so weak that I can't contribute from the local tax base enough money to make a significant difference. Even though we've increased money for books, we've increased money for new schools, we're doing a lot of different things to help in the classroom. But the fact of the matter is you still have to deal with poverty. Who is going to make the difference? Where is the funding source that's going to make the difference? And lastly, what are the collaborations which I think are really important in the future in urban school districts in dealing with poverty, because that's what this panel is about. Where are the collaborations with all those social service, health-related agencies, mental health agencies, all those other agencies that exist right now in a vacuum in different buildings? They should be in the school buildings providing those kinds of services for kids so that they can learn how to read and feel better about themselves. Learning isn't just a teacher's responsibility. A lot of kids today come to school underfed, undernourished, poor self-respect, don't know who they are, and they need those kinds of programs that exist. They need to be in the buildings too. So what I'm saying to you is collaboration of other agencies, other funding sources can make a difference.
Well, the bottom line, what you're saying is more money is not really forthcoming in any dramatic way.
I don't believe it is. I'll be honest with you because I have to deal with it every day.
Ms. Weingarten, how can we convince people to pay more? I mean, I saw a poll recently where 70% of Americans said if it was a dedicated tax going to public schooling, 70% of them said they would pay more taxes.
I often ask audiences the question in this manner. I say to people, would you encourage your kids or your grandkids to become teachers in the New York City public schools right now? And most people just kind of look at me and say no. And I say then, well, my job is to try to fight as much as I can to get the conditions and salaries to a point that you would convince your kids and grandkids to become teachers. Now, why do I say it to people that way? Because it hits home in a very, very visceral way. Ultimately, I think I'd look at people in New York. I've seen those polls repeatedly. A dedicated tax, just like when crime was skyrocketing, there was a dedicated tax effectively for police, even during Mayor Dinkins' time. And people saw that it went for those specific purposes, and people were okay about spending it that way. And I think people would be. I don't know about what happens in Buffalo, but I know in New York City, particularly right now, with the economy being what it is right now, if we don't try to solve the situation or try to start solving the situation right now, when you have a good economy, then we will never solve the situation. And ultimately it boils down to, is it a priority or not?
Reverend Flake, we got a full disclosure on Reverend Flake here. You know he has a school too. He has a school attached to his church. Reverend Flake, can you go, how big is your congregation now?
12,000.
12,000 people. Now that's a big number. Reverend Flake, can you go in the pulpit on Sunday and say to your congregation, all 12,000 of them, some of them who got deep pockets, I know, It's a moral battle here. We're in a moral battle. Even though I have a private school out back, a lot of you send your children to, I think you need to pay more taxes for public school. Can you say that? Do you believe that? First of all, you believe that to be true, and would you say it?
I could say it, but let me tell you, let's talk about reality. What happens in an urban community, when you cannot get a child educated in the urban community, people make three basic choices. One, you choose, many of them choose Catholic schools. Two, they choose private or other kind of parochial school. Three, and the most prominent, is to move to the suburbs. Now, our reality becomes, who do you tax? Because when you really look at a community like mine, which is Queens, next to Nassau County, people make the choice of moving out. I build homes for first-time home buyers. My first-time home buyers probably will live in that home from 3 to 5 years. When they get a child who is the age of that child in second grade, third grade, and they feel they cannot educate their child in Queens, New York, then they make a choice. Their choice is to buy a home somewhere in Nassau County or Suffolk County and move to work by whatever means necessary. But their concern about the child means that they have made a decision based on education. What we seem to fail to understand is that most parents make that choice based on education, and as they move up the socioeconomic ladder, we talk about white flight. The biggest problem of urban America has been middle-class African Americans who have moved from those communities. And they move for one primary reason. They do not believe they'll get a quality education in that school. So that if my congregation has in it almost 2,300, I think is our number, of people who live in Nassau County. I have other people who live in the Bronx and in Connecticut and everywhere else. Those people are not going to pay a tax in New York. And most of the people, quite frankly, who are in New York City, who do not believe the system can deliver for their children, are not going to vote a referendum to pay a tax when they will ask the question, why can't we find some other alternative for our children? Because they don't honestly believe that the system is going to reform quick enough. And Randy and I talk about this often in these kind of sessions when she talk about time. But the generation of parents who want their children educated today, they understand that they don't have that time. They cannot wait 2 years. They cannot wait 3 years. They want their child educated today. So rather than wait for the system to change, they go to where the system at least has a perception of being able to give their child a good quality education. The bottom line is they probably won't vote that in the city because they don't believe the system can deliver.
Let me just say also briefly, and I'll come to Ms. Ravage on the funding question. Those of you who want to pore over the numbers, the reading numbers from the scores, recent state scores, you will find some very ritzy addresses with some very dismal reading scores. You'll find some schools in East Hampton.
That's what I say.
You'll find some schools in West Hampton, some places where the per capita income is really sky high. So it's not just money in the surrounding area. But Ms. Ravage, we pretty much established, or if you disagree, tell us. We pretty much established that we need more better teachers, we need better buildings, we need textbooks, we need computers, we need more parental help. Does your district break? How do we solve the funding question here? You want to break down district lines and so on, but how in some way can that speak to the funding question?
Well, it's a complicated issue. I know you started this discussion today with reference to the court suit, and I would certainly favor more money for New York City. But it concerns me that this system, which has a budget of about $10 billion or so, give or take a few $100 million, if it wins the court suit, it will get another $280 million, which is less than 3% of its budget. It will not be enough money to do all the things we've been talking about today. What I think that I'm concerned about is that less than 50%, or maybe 48 to 50% of the money we do have doesn't go to classrooms. Now, I know we need things like we have to have money to pay bus drivers and transportation, and lunches and all of that, but 50% is a lot for all of those extra services. And there are other countries where 80% of the workers in education are teachers. In this system, that's not the case. So we really, I think, without saying that we don't need more funding, because I think we do, would say that we ought to be taking a really hard look at where that 50% of funding goes and how more of it could be put into the classroom, because in the end we're going to be faced with a choice, which we probably will not make. We can't both raise teachers' salaries and reduce class sizes, because when you reduce class sizes, you create an even bigger shortage in teachers, and then you end up paying even lower wages or not raising wages. And we'll be faced with this crunch and probably do a little bit of both. I would like to see the funding be much more child sensitive, so that the money follows the child, and the kids who are poor, who have the greatest needs, have the greatest dollars following them. And then you would see much more funding in poor neighborhoods than you do today. The way the system works is it counts one teacher equals one unit. Well, one teacher may be making $70,000 and the other may be making $30,000, but they're both just one unit. But if you had the funding in effect more transparent, you would know how much is spent per school for the whole thing, and you'd have the money following the child, so that where poor kids would be a lot more money to spend than we presently do. I'm no financial expert, but what I do know is that what we're presently spending, while it may not be enough, it's not allocated where it should be, which is in the classroom where the kids are.
Ms. Weingarten? We'll take a few questions. If anybody wants a question, line up at the mic here. You have a comment today?
You know, and Diane and I have had this conversation a lot. I think class size is very important, but I think having a well-prepared teacher in every single classroom is even more important. And ultimately, it does come down to how are we going to do that? And as Brent said before, we talked about the starting salaries, but if you look at an average salary, basically teachers in New York City make about $45,000, which is not enough to live a middle-class lifestyle. And ultimately, if we really want to change this, as I said, I think it's right. You need to have people who have the skills and the knowledge base in every single classroom. And if there was one thing that I could do, particularly right now when we're having this huge demographic shift of 21,000 of our educators eligible for retirement right now, which is why that number is so high, meaning why the Board of Ed thinks it needs 55,000 new teachers. If I could do one thing, it would be to try to create a system that we can attract and retain really top-flight educators, because ultimately then we can get to every single Janie.
Okay.
Give your name and ask your question.
George Farkas. I find this conversation very frustrating, very exciting and very frustrating, because the correct question was posed very strongly at the beginning. You pointed out that the National Academy of Sciences, the NIH research, shows that we know how to effectively do reading instruction, we're just not doing it. And a lot of people on the panel seem to agree to that. It seems to me that then we've wandered all over the map because we have this technical instructional failure, and so we're worried about everything else in the world, money, etc. But in fact, we have this technical instructional failure, and yet technical people know how to solve it. So I'd like you to answer the question, how can we solve it? Why aren't we... The reading question.
May I take a crack at that?
Please.
I think, in fact, it's a very, very complicated and difficult matter for schools to teach reading well. I think you have to, in effect, control the entire school. I don't think the 6-hour school day that we inherited from the era when American mothers lived at home is adequate to teach reading effectively. If you look at the reading program Success for All, that has the best documented research base of success, it requires, in fact, extraordinary efforts by teachers. It requires teachers to be extremely well trained. It requires that teachers have about twice as much time to teach reading as elementary schools typically afford. And in fact, it does require you to look at the whole system. It's not just a matter of buying a different textbook. It's a matter of changing the whole way in which the school functions. And so unless you have a comprehensive approach to this, I don't think you're going to do very much good.
Can I answer that?
Oh, well, I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
I'll give you a very pragmatic reason why. This year, for example, when we started negotiating, how to take over, how to have essentially the chancellor take over those 40 failing schools, the first thing we wanted to do was reading. And basically, and we put in extra time and an extra week so that teachers could learn the Success for All model in the summer. They were mandated to come in for that extra week, and the extra time, the 40 minutes a day, is for two things: for extra instruction for children and for the professional development and training that people needed. And then the math scores came out. And then the dilemma became, well, don't we have to do both at the same time? In my judgment, we should have just stayed with reading and not doing both, because what happens is, think about our own learning as adults. If you're learning a whole different way of teaching reading and a whole different way of teaching math all at the same time, you're not going to be as effective if you just learn one new thing. And the Success for All model, lots of these other models that we're talking about, have good track records, but what happens is we're teaching people who are smart, basically smart, dedicated people who want to learn and are committed to kids, but we're teaching them research that they never learned and practices that they never learned, and we need to teach them that as well. So I'm just pragmatically, what happened is we're doing both at the same time. Will the results be as good as if we just did reading? I don't think so. Over the 2 years, I hope so.
Let me just say, Bino and Randy are right, but let me just add this from my perspective. I think the system is too big. You can't identify problems. You know, people fall through the cracks. There's no consistency from schools to schools. I think what we need to do in large urban school districts is go back to school-based budgeting, put the principal in charge. They run the facility. They dictate what goes on there. They have more influence in hiring teachers. They have more influence in getting rid of teachers that unfortunately can't do it. They have more influence in dealing with parents and parenting and getting the parents involved. I really think we got to go back to smaller situations where you have more responsibility and more accountability and more control. That's how you're going to be able to improve, I think, student productivity at that level, the neighborhood level, by giving more authority and more responsibility and more accountability to a principal to run their school buildings with the personnel they think is
Thanks.
I'm going to sit down, but I just want to say 1 minute follow-up.
I need to move this forward.
Okay.
Excuse me.
All right.
Yeah, this has been really interesting, and I thank you all for your participation. I come from down south, where we knew the system was designed to keep us ignorant, and where there were no teacher pay, and where my mother-in-law, my wife, and my daughters have all taught in situations where there were one-room school in Alabama with 90 kids, all grades. Uganda, the south side of Atlanta with poor schools. One of the things they did as teachers was mobilize the peer group so that they educated each other, so that the smarter kids in the class taught reading to the less fortunate kids. I don't know whether that's possible in big cities in the north. The other thing is, Mr. Mayor, I don't know whether we could give a tax exemption to teachers and policemen who live in the community where they work.
Well, we do, Mr. Young, firstly, let me just say, HUD is giving cities now the authority to give first-time home buyer monies to policemen and firemen, and I think they're extending that to other city employees. That is certainly very, very helpful. But look at where the teachers live today. They're not living, most of them don't live in the cities. They live in the suburban communities. Matter of fact, most of them don't send their kids to the schools that they teach in or the system they teach in. So that's a major problem also. But having
Let me
teachers...
just say, it's not true in New York. 75% of our members live in the city now.
Good.
Okay. Next.
I'm a product of the system that you described. And one of the things that I think is we have to deal with a reality that go back to where I began the process, that is level of expectation. The 4-room classroom with 8 classes that I came through elementary school in, teachers had that level of expectation that you talk about. The other issue becomes one of whether we talk about inequities in the as if we can resolve them by raising the level of urban schools financing to the level of suburban schools. Our reality, though, is that there are inequities within the systems in this city. Community school boards where you have schools in the more affluent parts of those districts where they have all the resources necessary. and schools in other parts where they do not have access to the resources. So that even as we talk about what's happening outside of the city, we have some real homework to do in the city so that the affluent parts of districts do not have access to computers and books and all the training materials, and that is not given to the same schools in the same district.
Next question.
Thank you. Robin Tarosian. I teach at Pace University. And I'm interested in I'm wondering why we're not shifting any of the discourse from the economics of the problem of reading to what goes on with kids. Why, how, and why we turn off kids to reading. How we create anxiety
Be our guest.
in
Shift.
kids.
Go ahead.
Well, then what should be the questions? There should be different questions asked if we start to talk about how do we prevent the rebellion? How do we encourage rebellion among kids and show them how their rebelliousness could be channeled into productive drives where they can find usefulness in reading? How can we teach them or show them how reading can actually help them solve their own personal problems, work problems? Most of school doesn't usually focus on those issues. Where we're not talking, this whole discourse isn't really talking about the problem with the delivery model of education and how to shift to the conceptual understandings students need. What would the different questions be?
Well, I guess that's a question. That's a complicated, open-ended question, and it'll take more time than we have here to deal with. But if you have one interrogative beyond a question that asks a series of questions, please ask it concisely.
No, I guess I couldn't really ask it more except to say it may help as a suggestion to focus on conceptual understandings. A lot of the standards movement now has talked about relationships that students need to understand, critical thinking skills in terms of compare and contrast, various conceptual understandings. If we shift the focus in schools to how students can actually use skills in their own lives, then we may get somewhere as far as how they actually address the inequities in schools.
I think you see that happening in a lot of different schools. Let me talk about junior high school age. Let me talk about it in two ways. One, when you hear the mayor and Chancellor Crew and others talking about needing to have more art, more music, more physical education, it's a way of trying to excite kids and attract kids back into school and trying to integrate literacy with that. But that, in and of itself, is something we have to teach people how to do. But second, there are lots and lots of schools that do exactly what you suggested. But what happens is a very big system. So we have, for example, in junior high school 8, junior high school that was the pits of the pits that is now turned around, is off this SIR list, which is the underperforming list. What they created was they created a culinary magnet, which excited children in a way that they weren't excited before, and they created that kind of thing. And you have schools throughout the city who do exactly the same thing. But the real issue becomes, how do you, at a very, very early age, diagnose all the issues and needs that children have to get them reading? And that means in kindergarten and first grade and second grade.
Next question.
My name is Jeannie Oakes. I'm more than a little troubled by this conversation, and I'd like to tell you why and ask a question. It seems to me that since the founding of our republic, one of the basic principles has been that we need public schools that educate all children well, and that the quality of our democracy will depend on that. As soon as we start talking about Janie, this panel I thought was going to talk about inequalities in our system's willingness to educate well poor children as well as rich children. As soon as we start talking about Janie and whether or not her parents have a choice to walk away from a bad school, it seems to me we've turned a conversation away from that collective responsibility for all children to what an individual parent can do for their own child. That's a very important issue, and I think parents do and understandably want to do everything they can for their own child. But as long as we operate a school system and think about public policies in those terms, we know historically that those parents with the most power will get the most for their children, and parents with less will get less. My view is that Janie's mom not only needs to worry about Janie, but Janie's mom needs to learn something I think very important that we learned from Martin Luther King. That ordinary people acting together can take collective responsibility for making lives and institutions better. And I do not hear that in the discussion about choice.
Well,
I'd like the panel to address that.
Well, as the person who shifted the debate in that direction, let me just say briefly, I find your comment bracing, and in the abstract, I embrace it. However, as Reverend Flake has said, we're in a situation where we're looking at system-wide remedies, an enormous system that needs big fixes, and a child who has no time. And that is, if you stay at the abstract level, you really, really got a situation.
Let me tell you about my friend named Rose Sanders, who some of you know, who lives in Selma, Alabama. Rose is a civil rights attorney, but her school only knew of her child as a black child. Rose's daughter, as a black child, was placed in a class for kids who weren't expected to go anywhere.
So was I.
Okay. Rose went to the school, got out her Harvard law degree, rattled a few cages, and got her daughter out of that class, into the class where kids were expected to be challenged. Well, Rose didn't stop there. She went home and called every other parent in that school and said, this is what's going on here. This is what we need to do. We need to take back our school. And boy, did the superintendent listen, the school board listen. I think even the New York Times listened when Rose Sanders did that. And that's all I'm asking for, is a sense that as long as we focus on individual solutions to systemic problems rather than thinking about social movements to act collectively, to take back our schools, our public schools, for democracy for all children, then we'll be mired down in thinking about technical fixes or who should make which decision. And we'll never get anywhere on this problem.
But the grassroots parents are saying, you are correct, and they are saying that they're not trying to take back that school. What they're saying is, we will create new schools and new educational opportunities. That's why vouchers and charters have become such a popular issue at the grassroots level, because that movement is occurring. We're trying to deny that it's occurring, but in reality, it's happening. The grassroots parents in this city and the 40-some cities I visited over the last year are saying, we don't think they can do it. We want an alternative to that. And that's where the whole problem is now. When you get the collective people together who have children in the system, they're saying we want out of the system.
Ms. Ravitch?
And that's a difficult problem.
Ms. Ravitch?
Yeah, I would say, Ms. Oaks, that the issue you raised was not overlooked, because in the first response that I made to Brent Staples, I said there's a question of whether you give a collective response for the system or you speak about the parents or the parent of Janie, about what do you do about Janie. And those may be different answers. And I think that the system answer that I keep coming back to is most people, most teachers have not been trained correctly. They do not know how to teach reading, and worst of all, they don't know that they don't know how to teach reading. So they say, let's spend more time not doing the right thing. And as Mr. Staples opened by saying, we now know that if you don't have instruction and the connection between the letters and the sounds of letters, the chances are you will not learn to read. And this is not what's being taught in our schools. I can't tell you how many elementary schools I've been in where the principal has said to me with great pride, we do not teach phonics in this school. We are doing the wrong thing on a massive, systematic scale, and we're doing nothing about it other than what Randy mentioned in terms of retraining a handful of teachers. Meanwhile, we have a system for 1 million kids doing the wrong thing every day.
Mayor, you have something?
Yeah, well, on the parenting thing, I think there's two issues. Number one, I don't think school systems, at least the ones I'm familiar with back in my part of the state, have encouraged parental involvement. Once you start encourage parental involvement, then a lot of principals and a lot of school administration people don't like to hear what they're going to hear. So there never has been, or they thwarted that kind of involvement. So that has to be improved, no question about it. But also, there are a large number of parents that are not involved with their child's education for a whole host of reasons. That's a large group that we have to get some way to help them understand the importance of networking with their child in their school-related activities. That's a very, very important void that needs to be filled in local urban communities.
We have two more questions, then we have to break in the interim for the next panel. Please, sir.
Michael D'Innocenzo. I teach at Hofstra University. I'd like to come back and build on the previous speaker with the issue of the systemic issues involved. I read recently from the Public Agenda Foundation and Kettering Foundation that there are actually 40 states in which there's some kind of lawsuits going on about educational equity, and the American Civil Liberties Union is using some of those. Mark Twain once said he never confused his schooling with his education. And I say that because I appreciated Mr. Schmidt's comment about the comprehensive kind of context. And I think if I understood the previous speaker, previous questioner, I think the big issue here is how we place the schools in the larger context of the society. And I'm so glad we began with Mr. Goldstein talking about Martin Luther King's concerns. But we know his concerns moved along those triple evils, from racism to poverty to war. So we talk about allocation of resources and reallocation of resources. It seems to me, particularly as we enter the millennium and a presidential race in 2000, is this on the radar screen for the bully pulpit of candidates? Is there an empty pulpit? Do you see any prospect this can become this issue of education that citizens are yearning to discuss in substantive ways can really be addressed by candidates who are out in the stump now?
Let me just jump in for a minute as moderator and say that, in fact, there is some debate in the campaign, but not nearly enough. And I would like to put on your radar screen, and let me just say, for the record, I'm registered independent. I don't belong to any party. But that's Carl McCall, the controller. And when he speaks, I listen. But we've been spending, those of us who are interested in this subject have been spending a great deal of time in Texas. And in Texas, thanks, in fact, to that ambiguous figure, Ross Perot, back in the 80s, he chaired a panel in Texas looking at, sort of standards issues statewide. And in Texas, a few years ago, they did a thing. They've built on incremental developments across governors, across parties, incremental developments. And what they've done in Texas now is they've established a target and rating system for the school. So if you have the equivalent of a New Canaan school, let's say outside of Houston, the richest high school outside of Houston, if you are, say, 75% white, and 75% of your students are in, say, the top percentile in reading, and 25% in the bottom, they rate your school mediocre. Your real estate values depress, and the principal and the Board of Education are now in their cars driving around to those minority student homes saying, what can we do to help you? It's gotten extreme in some cases. Where, in fact, 4 or 5 students can depress the entire rating of a district. And the system's not perfect. It's not working up to par as it should be, but they're ratcheting up the standards. But in effect, what they're saying is our fates are combined. Now, that's not quite a George Bush policy, but you're going to see that opened up and aired more and more as this campaign goes forward. And I agree with you. There's not much debate about it. There's very little leadership at the campaign level at this point. And people, I agree with you, are in fact yearning about it. People want to hear some direction from it. But one of the problems is we have a national leadership that's stuck in this debate about whether it is the government's role to reach into localities to deal with the subjects of national import. And federal leadership had great trepidation in this, and they're sort of stuck in a gridlock. Next question.
Can I answer that question?
Sure.
Since I'm a politician also and a government official. Firstly, if you look at the gross national product of this country, a percentage spent on education, it's woefully low compared to other countries in the free world. It's a travesty. It's unconscionable what the federal government spends for education in America. Secondly, right now this country's on a boom. Not everybody, but obviously there are a large number of people doing very, very well. Wait till that boom ends. If this country can't compete with other countries in this world, and the only way we're going to be able to compete is if you have competent, qualified workers for the employees for the employers. If we don't have a competent, qualified workforce coming out of urban America, we're not going to be able to have the great economy we have right now as we go into new millennium, because the competition, we're not going to be able to compete. So we have to insist that federal government antes up in urban America to help educate young people. I can't educate people with the poverty and the property tax base in the city of Buffalo. No city can do that kind of job. And quite frankly, Brent, if they can come up with housing policies, if they can come up with policies to help increase the number of police to protect people, then certainly they can find the financial resources to help educate people in urban America.
Last question.
Is there an economic value to corporate America or the private sector becoming involved in public schools?
My quick answer, very short answer, is that in many states, and including this one, they have recognized that the fates of corporations are intertwined with the citizens, and that it's really it's primary. Big corporations like IBM, for example, are getting involved in the reform movement because, in fact, they realize their fates are intertwined. But go on.
Yeah, we have 80 schools in Buffalo. We have 105 partnerships with business and not-for-profit agencies networking with our schools. M&T Bank, matter of fact, adopted a school. They had the lowest performing standards of any school in the city. Now they're one of the highest. The fact of the matter is, where corporate America does roll up its sleeves and get involved, there are significant benefits and increased standards and accomplishment.
I got to cut it off here because we're really running late. I mean, that's my fault for not being moderate. But the second panel will be moderated by Ambassador Andrew Young, and it's going to meet here at 11:15. And thank you very much for your engagement.
Thank you. That was really great.
Thank you.
Good to see you again.
See, it's real to me. It's not that.